Please, close your eyes for just a moment. Try to remember the very specific, sharp smell of the burning coal stove in your living room on a freezing winter evening. Or perhaps recall the cheerful ringing of a heavy bicycle bell as your friends rode up to your front door to play outside. Do you feel that sudden warmth in your chest? Today, we are taking a gentle journey back in time, back to the Netherlands of our youth. We are going to explore 20 beautiful, everyday Dutch traditions from the 1960s, 70s and 80s that have slowly slipped away from our modern world. These were the simple routines that shaped our childhoods, gave rhythm to our days and bound our neighborhoods together. And make sure to stay with me until the very end, because we will talk about a deeply comforting evening ritual that used to signal the end of every child's day, something that will surely make you long for those innocent times. Time felt remarkably different back then, did it not? It did not rush past us in a blur of glowing screens and constant notifications. Instead, time flowed gently, much like the quiet canals running through our towns. We knew how to wait, and waiting actually made the reward so much sweeter. We waited for our favorite television program to air on one of the only 2 channels available. We waited for Sunday to wear our very best clothes. We waited for the changing of the seasons to bring us specific joys. Today, people often assume that because we had fewer technological distractions, our lives must have been somehow less exciting or poorer. But you and I know the absolute truth. Life was incredibly rich. Our wealth was not in digital things, but in genuine human connection, in the quiet sincerity of a shared cup of coffee, and in the profound trust we had in our neighbors. The world was smaller. Our streets were our entire universe, and everything we truly needed was right there, within walking distance of our front doors. Let us begin with a sound that started almost every morning. Do you remember the distinctive rattling noise echoing through your street? It was the familiar sound of the local milkman making his daily rounds. Long before the era of massive impersonal supermarkets, the milkman brought the dairy straight to your front door. You could hear the clinking of heavy glass bottles in his metal crates long before he actually rang your bell. It was not just a delivery, it was a daily social check-in for the whole neighborhood. Housewives would step out onto their front steps, wiping their hands on their aprons, to buy fresh milk, buttermilk, and sometimes a creamy yellow custard we called vla. The milkman knew everyone by name. He knew who was sick, and he knew exactly how many bottles your family needed without even having to ask. He kept track of your tap in a small, worn-out leather notebook with a stubby pencil. The glass bottles were cold and heavy in your hands, often covered in a thin layer of morning condensation. We would wash those bottles and return them the next day, a perfect cycle before the word recycling even existed. We did not just lose a convenient service when the milkman disappeared. We lost the friendly face who tied our little communities together. And speaking of daily rhythms, nothing was more sacred than the ritual of morning coffee time. At exactly 10:30 every single morning, everything in a Dutch household came to a complete halt. It did not matter what you were doing, it was time to sit down. The table was cleared, a lovely embroidered tablecloth might be laid out, and the cups and saucers were arranged with care. But the most crucial part of this tradition was the cookie tin. The mother of the house would open a beautiful, often heavily decorated tin of cookies, perhaps a tin saved from the Verkade factory. She would offer the open tin around the table. The golden rule, deeply ingrained in every Dutch child, was that you were allowed to take exactly 1 cookie. Not 2, never a handful, just 1. It was a beautiful lesson in modesty and appreciation. We would slowly nibble on that single biscuit, perhaps a crunchy speculoos or a buttery spritz, making it last as long as the hot coffee or tea in our cups. This was a moment of true pause, a dedicated time to talk about the day ahead, to share local news, and to simply be present with one another before the chores resumed. Now, let us remember the magic of saving Dove Egberts points. In almost every kitchen cupboard across the country, there was a specific drawer or a little tin dedicated to this glorious pursuit. Every time a package of coffee or tea was opened, there was a small red seal printed on the packaging. With a pair of scissors, we would carefully cut out these valuable little rectangles. They represented a unique currency of coziness. You had to save hundreds, sometimes thousands of them. It was a family effort. Even grandmothers and aunts would save their points and give them to young couples setting up their homes. Once you had enough, you would neatly bundle them up, count them multiple times, and take a trip to the special gift shop. The smell of fresh coffee in those shops was simply intoxicating. You would trade your paper points for beautiful porcelain cups, shiny new coffee spoons, or perhaps a new serving tray. It taught us the immense value of patience and collective effort. You did not just buy a coffee cup, you earned it over months of shared family breakfasts and evening teas. Do you recall the heavy, imposing presence of the green telephone booths scattered across our towns? They belonged to the National Postal Service, and they were our only connection to the outside world when we were away from home. Stepping inside one of those booths was a sensory experience. You would pull the heavy glass door shut, instantly muffling the sounds of the traffic outside. The air inside always smelled faintly of stale tobacco and old paper from the thick, heavily thumbed phone directories hanging on chains. You had to make sure you had enough heavy guilder or quarter coins in your pocket before you picked up the heavy black receiver. Pushing the coin into the slot and dialing the rotary phone required physical effort. And then came the stress of the ticking meter. You had to speak quickly and get straight to the point, because once your coins ran out, the line would abruptly go dead. People waiting outside the booth would tap on the glass if you took too long. It made every phone call intentional and important. We did not call just to pass the time. We called because we had something meaningful to say. Let us take a walk back to the living room and feel the intense, glowing heat of the coal stove. Before central heating became the standard in every home, the coal stove was the literal and emotional center of the house. During the harsh winters, only the living room was truly warm. The bedrooms upstairs were so freezing cold that beautiful, fern-like ice crystals would form on the inside of the single-pane windows. But downstairs, around the stove, it was wonderfully cozy. We remember the coalman arriving with his face covered in black soot, carrying heavy burlap sacks on his back to fill the bunker in the shed. Lighting the stove was an art form requiring crumpled newspaper, small pieces of kindling, and perfectly placed lumps of coal. We would sit as close to the mica windows of the stove as possible, watching the mesmerizing red and orange glow of the burning coals. Sometimes we would roast chestnuts or peel mandarins near the heat, the citrus oils scenting the warm air. It brought the whole family into one room, forcing us to spend our winter evenings together, playing board games or reading by the fire. There was a very specific excitement that belonged to our teenage years, and it sounded like the static crackle of a small transistor radio. We are talking about the era of the pirate radio stations, most famously Radio Veronica. Broadcasting from a ship bobbing in the rough waters of the North Sea, they played the kind of popular pop and rock music that the state-run broadcasters simply refused to touch. We would sneak our small radios under our blankets at night, twisting the dial millimeter by millimeter to find the signal through the static. The music sounded rebellious, fresh, and incredibly exciting. It was the soundtrack to our youth. We recorded songs onto cassette tapes, furiously pressing the play and record buttons at the exact same time, always praying the radio DJ would not start talking over the final guitar solo. The day the pirate ships were forced to stop broadcasting felt like a true day of mourning for an entire generation. We did not just lose a radio station, we lost a symbol of our newfound teenage freedom and the thrilling sound of the swinging 60s and 70s. Let us turn our minds to the golden freedom of Wednesday afternoons. In our time, primary schools would close their doors exactly at 12:15 on Wednesdays. The entire afternoon stretched out before us like an endless ocean of possibility. We did not have scheduled play dates, organized sports clinics, or screens to look at. We simply ran out into the streets, grabbed our coats, and played outside until the streetlights flickered on. We built elaborate wooden huts in the patches of wasteland near our neighborhoods, using stolen nails and discarded planks. We played intensive games of hide-and-seek that spanned entire residential blocks. We skipped rope, drew massive hopscotch grids with thick chalk, and scraped our knees climbing brick walls. The mothers were inside, usually doing the weekly mending or ironing, keeping a loose eye on the chaos through the front windows. If you were thirsty, you drank water from the garden hose or ran inside for a quick glass of lemonade before rushing back out. That unsupervised, unstructured time was where we learned how to resolve conflicts, how to imagine, and how to be truly free. Do you remember the absolute thrill of playing marbles in the schoolyard? When spring finally arrived and the ground was dry enough, a true marble craze would sweep through the school. Every child carried a small cloth bag, tightly pulled shut with a string, heavy with the weight of glass treasures. We knew all the specific names for the different sizes and patterns. There were the small standard ones, the beautiful clear glass ones with colored ribbons inside, and the massive heavy boulders we called the tweeters. We would dig a small hole in the dirt or find a missing paving stone to use as our target. The rules were complex, unwritten, and fiercely negotiated on the spot. Losing your favorite, luckiest marble to a classmate felt like a devastating bankruptcy, while winning a beautiful new one made you feel like a king for the day. Our fingers would be covered in dust and sent by the time the bell rang to go back inside. It was our first lesson in economics, in taking calculated risks, and in the sheer tactile joy of beautiful, shiny objects clinking together in our pockets. One of the most remarkable sights that slowly disappeared from our streets was the SRV wagon. This was literally a driving supermarket, a large, boxy electric bus that would park right on your street corner. When you stepped up through the folding doors, you were immediately hit by the unique combined smell of fresh bread, strong cheese, floor wax, and washing powder. The inside was a marvel of spatial engineering. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were packed tightly with everything a housewife could possibly need in a pinch. The driver was part grocer, part confidant, and part neighborhood watch. He knew exactly who bought which brand of coffee and who needed a bit of extra time to pay their bill that month. For the elderly or those without cars, the SRV wagon was an absolute lifeline. As children, we loved it when our mothers sent us into the wagon with a few coins to buy a forgotten jar of peanut butter or a single roll of biscuits. It was a cozy, intimate way of shopping where commerce was completely secondary to human connection and community service. A true hallmark of our childhoods was the deeply ingrained tradition of eating bread with chocolate sprinkles, the famous hagelslag. But it was not just about eating it, it was about the meticulous ritual of preparation. First, you needed a slice of good, hearty bread. Then came the butter. The butter had to be spread with absolute precision, reaching every single corner and crust. If you missed a spot, it was a disaster, because the butter acted as the crucial glue. Then, you carefully tipped the rectangular cardboard box, letting the chocolate sprinkles cascade down. We would use the flat side of our knife to press the sprinkles firmly into the butter, trying to create a solid, impenetrable layer of chocolate. Of course, the moment you took a bite, half of the sprinkles would stubbornly fall off onto your plate anyway. We would wet our fingers to pick up every last stray sprinkle from the plate, ensuring nothing went to waste. It was a perfectly sweet, simple lunch or breakfast that required zero cooking but delivered maximum joy. Even today, the smell of real chocolate sprinkles instantly transports us back to the kitchen table of our youth. Let us talk about the rhythm of Saturday mornings, which was defined by a very specific rhythmic sound. It was the sharp, echoing thwack of the rattan carpet beater, the mattenklopper. Before vacuum cleaners became incredibly powerful and ubiquitous, the deep cleaning of rugs happened outside. Housewives would drag their heavy, woolen living room carpets or long hallway runners outside and drape them over a sturdy clothesline or a brick wall. Then, with a strong, practiced swing, they would beat the dust out of the fabric. You could see thick clouds of grey dust rising into the crisp morning air. The sound would echo down the street, almost like a strange, syncopated drumbeat, as different neighbors joined in. It was hard, physical labor, but it was also an opportunity to chat over the garden fences. While beating the rugs, women would exchange recipes, discuss the neighborhood gossip, or talk about their children. The house always smelled remarkably fresh and deeply clean after the rugs were brought back inside, carrying the scent of the cool outside wind with them into the living room. There was no day of the week quite as quiet as a traditional Dutch Sunday. The concept of the Sunday rest was deeply respected, regardless of whether you were religious or not. The streets were completely empty. There were no cars driving by, no lawnmowers making noise, and absolutely no shops were open. People wore their Sunday best clothes, sharply pressed suits and beautiful dresses that were carefully protected during the rest of the week. After attending church, or simply after a slow morning, families would go for a dignified walk in the nearby woods or park. The afternoon was strictly reserved for visiting family. We would sit in formal living rooms, drinking tea from delicate cups and eating a slice of cake, while the adults talked for hours. As children, we sometimes found it incredibly boring, as we were not allowed to play wildly or get our good clothes dirty. But looking back, that forced pause, that complete absence of commercial pressure and rushing around, gave our minds a chance to truly rest and reset for the coming week. Can you remember the magical transformation that happened to our country when the winters were truly cold, when the canals and lakes froze over with thick, solid natural ice? A collective fever gripped the entire nation. It was the time for ice skating on natural ice. Schools would sometimes give us ice holidays, letting us out early so we could skate until the sun went down. We wore wooden skates, the traditional freeze-door loppers, which we tied tightly under our regular shoes with thick leather straps. Your ankles would ache and the cold wind would bite your cheeks until they turned bright red, but the feeling of gliding over the dark, frozen water was pure magic. Along the banks of the larger canals, small wooden stalls called kugenzopi would magically appear. Here, you could buy a steaming cup of hot chocolate or warm anise milk, cupping your freezing hands around the hot mug to thaw your fingers. Everyone was equal on the ice, from the mayor to the baker, all moving together in a beautiful, rhythmic sway across the frozen Dutch landscape. Let us step into a traditional candy store, perhaps a classic Jamin with a few shiny coins in our pockets. Buying candy was a serious mathematical undertaking. We did not buy pre-packaged plastic bags of sweets. Instead, we stood before a massive wall of glass jars, filled to the brim with every color and shape imaginable. Our absolute favorite, of course, was the traditional salty licorice, the dropjes. The shopkeeper would take a small, square piece of paper and expertly twist it into a cone shape right before our eyes. We would point at the jars, calculating exactly how many coins we had. 2 cents of the salty coins, 3 cents of the sweet honey licorice, and perhaps a long, chewy lace for good measure. The shopkeeper would use a small metal scoop to drop the treasures into the paper cone. Walking out of the shop, carefully holding that paper cone so nothing would spill, felt like carrying a tremendous prize. We would make that small amount of candy last for hours, savoring each distinct flavor, appreciating the value of our hard-earned pocket money. Another weekly milestone was Friday, which for many families was traditionally fish day. Even those who were not strict Catholics often followed this rhythm. The highlight of this day was the trip to the local fishmonger at the market square. The smell of frying oil, brine, and fresh ocean catch was unmistakable from streets away. The great ritual was buying fresh, raw herring. They were prepared right in front of you, the fishmonger expertly cleaning them with swift, sharp movements of his knife. They were served on a small paper plate, heavily covered in sharply scented, diced onions. We would grab the herring by the tail, tilt our heads back, and lower the fish into our mouths in one smooth motion. The taste was rich, salty, and wonderfully fresh. Our fingers would smell like fish for the rest of the day, no matter how many times we washed them. It was a culinary tradition that connected us directly to our nation's long, proud history as seafarers and fishermen, a simple meal that was elevated to a beloved weekly event. Do you remember the sheer physical effort required to ride a bicycle back then? We did not have lightweight frames or 21 different gears. We rode heavy, solid black Omafice, the grandmother bikes, made of thick steel. They had no handbrakes, only a back pedal brake that required you to push backward with all your might to stop. The tires were thick and the leather saddle was stiff. When you had to cycle to school against the fierce Dutch headwind, it was a true test of endurance. There was no electric assistance to push you forward. You had to stand up on the pedals, leaning your entire body weight into every rotation just to move an inch forward while the rain lashed at your face. We wore heavy rain suits that made us sweat terribly on the inside while protecting us from the wet outside. But that daily struggle built character and strong legs. Arriving at school, shaking off the rain and hanging your wet coat in the hallway gave you a sense of accomplishment before the first lesson had even begun. In the height of summer, Especially for those living near the coastal provinces, there was a very specific way teenagers earned their pocket money. It was the season of peeling flower bulbs, the bloembollen pelle. We would sit for hours, sometimes days, in massive, drafty wooden sheds that smelled heavily of dry earth and old tulip bulbs. Our job was to clean the bulbs, removing the dry outer layers and the small baby bulbs attached to the bottom. It was repetitive, dirty work. Your fingernails would turn completely black with dirt, and the dust would make you sneeze constantly. We sat on overturned wooden crates, working our way through massive piles of bulbs, getting paid per basket we finished. But it was incredibly fun too. The sheds were filled with the chatter of dozens of teenagers, flirting, gossiping, and listening to loud music on portable radios. It was hard work, but when we finally held those hard-earned guilders in our dirty hands, we felt incredibly proud and completely independent. Let us think back to the celebration of Queen's Day, Koninginnedag, exactly as it was meant to be. Before massive electronic music festivals took over, this day was entirely dedicated to innocent, traditional street games. Every neighborhood committee would organize activities for the children. The absolute classic was koekhappen. A thick slice of spiced cake, the pepperkoek, was hung on a string suspended between two trees. We would be blindfolded, our hands tied behind our backs, and we had to jump up and try to take a bite out of the swinging cake. It was hilarious, messy, and resulted in sticky faces and immense laughter. Then there was spijkerpoepen, where a large nail was tied to a string around our waist, and we had to squat carefully to lower the nail into an empty glass bottle. The streets were decorated with orange flags, and everyone wore bright orange ribbons in their hair or pinned to their coats. It was a day of profound, simple joy, where a piece of cake on a string was enough to make a child perfectly happy. As the evening approached, another comforting sound took over the kitchen. It was the high-pitched singing of the whistling kettle on the gas stove. This was the signal that the busy day was truly over, and the evening relaxation could begin. We did not have electric kettles that boiled water in a matter of seconds. You had to fill the heavy metal kettle, place it on the blue flames of the gas burner, and wait. The anticipation was part of the charm. First, you would hear a low rumble as the water heated up, which slowly escalated into a shrill, piercing whistle that demanded immediate attention. Mother would rush to the stove, turn off the gas, and pour the boiling water over loose tea leaves in a porcelain pot. The pot was then covered with a thick, insulated fabric tea cozy to keep it warm. We would sit in the living room, pouring small cups of strong tea, perhaps reading the evening newspaper or watching the news. The whistle of that kettle was the universal alarm clock, signaling peace, warmth, and family time. And finally, as the evening deepened and bedtime approached, there was one deeply magical ritual that every child waited for. It was the broadcasting of the children's television program right before bed, most notably the Fabeltjeskrant. At exactly 5 minutes to 7, we would sit cross-legged on the carpet, glued to the television screen, waiting for Meneer de Uil, the wise owl, to appear on his branch. We listened in awe to the daily gossip and adventures of the animals in the great animal forest. It was completely mesmerizing, a brief escape into a gentle moral world. But the most important moment came at the very end. The owl would blink his eyes, look directly at us through the screen, and tell us it was time to go to sleep. When he spoke those famous closing words, we did not argue. We knew the day was truly over. We brushed our teeth, climbed the cold stairs to our bedrooms, and fell asleep with our heads full of animal stories. It was a collective bedtime for an entire generation of children. When we look back at these 20 memories, it becomes wonderfully clear that we do not just miss the physical objects themselves. We do not just miss the heavy bicycles, the glass milk bottles, or the ticking phone booths. What we truly miss is how those things made us feel. We miss the profound sense of community, the patience we had for one another, and the comforting predictability of a world that moved at a human pace. We miss a time when a simple piece of chocolate on bread or a pirate radio song was enough to fill our hearts with joy. Our youth was a magical time, not because it was perfect, but because it was real, tactile, and deeply shared. If these stories brought a wave of warmth to your heart, please subscribe to our channel and leave a like to support our journey into the past. And now, I would love to hear from you. Which of these traditions do you miss the most? Or what specific smell from your childhood instantly takes you back in time? Please share your beautiful memories in the comments below so we can keep our shared history alive together.